Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robbie Malina, and I'm chairing the invited speaker session by Professor Kurt Kohn. Now, Professor Kurt Kohn is Emeritus Professor of Applied English Linguistics at the University of Tübingen, Germany. His professional interests include intercultural collaboration, English as a lingua franca, and foreign language teacher education. Recent articles include learner agency and non-native speaker identity in pedagogical lingua franca conversations, and an editor book chapter on Towards the Reconciliation of ELF, or English as a lingua franca, and EFL, which is English as a foreign language, published by the Multilingual Matters in 2018. Now, this morning, Professor Kurt Kohn will speak on the topic on English as a lingua franca, from research to pedagogy. Now, Professor Kohn will speak for about 40 minutes, and the remaining time will be for a question and answer session. And may I now invite Professor Kurt Kohn to deliver his plenary paper.
Thank you very much, Robbie, for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure being here, and that you made it all up the stairs or the lift or whichever way you took. This talk is about English as a lingua franca, or ELF. It's ELF for the insiders, EFL for the outsiders. So ELF and English language teaching, ELT. And it is about the pedagogical connection between the two. Now, to begin with, I should state that ELF and ELT are not and have never been best friends. ELF speakers manage to communicate successfully by making creative use of their linguistic resources without observing ELT and standard English norms that are common in English language teaching. ELT practitioners, in turn, when faced with pedagogical suggestions from the ELF camp, might easily feel that they are being invited to teach incorrect English. When looking at some of the debates between the two, one might easily get the impression of two trains rushing towards each other on the same track. I don't know where you stand in this debate between ELF and ELT, but you have my sympathies, both of you. And it all hinges on standard English. Well, but standard English is not the problem. The way it is taught definitely is. To give you an idea in which direction this talk is going to develop, I would like to tell you a few things about myself. You have certainly figured out by now that I'm a non-native speaker of English. I have my foreign language learning roots with English and French and Latin in a secondary school in Germany in the 60s. 1960s. My English teacher had a wide heart for communication well before the communicative turn, but I nevertheless developed a very strong preference for standard native speaker English and a desire for being correct, a desire which more often than not, I was only able to satisfy by keeping my mouth shut, in particular when I was communicating with native speakers. Now, can you imagine my distress when many, many years later, at my first ELF conference, several speakers, all of them native speakers, clearly argued against my standard native English orientation. Native speaker English, outside my reach, just not my social-linguistic cup of tea. And besides native speakers, do they speak standard English? And standard English, isn't it a myth anyways? You can imagine my distress. I became painfully aware of two souls in my breast. On the one hand, my desire for standard native speaker English, which I was told was unrealistic, and on the other hand, my strong feeling that this desire was part of my English identity. After careful deliberation, I decided to eat the cake and have it. Today, I want to convince you that it is indeed possible to reconcile the two hostile brothers and to create a space for ELF in the ELT classroom. To get there, these are my topics, or the issues I want to touch on. First, a few words on conceptualizations of English, and then on to acquiring English, dimensions of ELF competence, standard native speaker English as a target language model, English as a pedagogical lingua franca, and finally a few insights from case studies. Conceptualizations of ELF. Since its very beginnings, ELF research has been under the influence of two conceptualizations of ELF. On the one hand, ELF as a variety of English in its own right. On the other hand, ELF as communicative interaction. These two concepts have important pedagogical implications which are fundamentally different. When if we conceptualize ELF as a variety of English, our pedagogical attention is quite naturally drawn to the linguistic means of expression that should or should not be taught, which easily confirms teachers' suspicion that it's about incorrect English. If, however, we conceptualize ELF as communication, the pedagogical implication is centered on helping students to further develop their strategic abilities to use their English under ELF conditions. Over the past 10 years, our understanding of ELF has been enriched by the translanguaging paradigm. In particular, with regard to the insight that lingua franca English, this is Kanagaraja's term, lingua franca English is not given as a preset entity, but rather emerges from translingual practice in local contexts. I refer you to Kanagaraja and Pennycook, and there will certainly be more on this at this conference. Now, if we adopt this view, then teaching and learning is focused on learning to negotiate diverse lingua franca, lingua cultural resources in translingual practice. More recently, the paradigm of translanguaging has been embraced by ELF scholars, in particular by Jennifer Jenkins, in an attempt to inaugurate a new phase of ELF research under the umbrella of English as a multilingua franca. English as a multilingua franca. Now, I am not entirely convinced of the explanatory power of this somewhat lopsided emphasis on the various languages speakers bring to bear when they engage in ELF communication. In particular, since this emphasis might distract from something which I feel is very important, namely ELF speakers' readiness and capability of taking control of what they are doing. ELF speakers are not pigeons in linguistic complexity games. They are actually in charge. And this, I feel, needs to be accounted for in theory and in pedagogy. So, what about teaching and learning how to monitor the collaborative negotiation of diverse lingua-cultural repertoires for communicative and communal success? How can we approach it? My suggestion is to approach this research issue from a social constructivist perspective, very much in the tradition of Vygotsky. A little thought experiment might help to get us started. Imagine us communicating with each other at this conference. Which English do we speak? Do we speak some kind of international English? Some kind of global English? Do we speak multilingua franca English? Well, I think we all speak the English we are most comfortable with, and that is our own individual Englishes, my English, so to speak. My English. That's the only possibility for me. And we, across our various my Englishes, we do our level best to make communication work. What is my English? In search of an answer, we need to go back to the question with which it all begins, namely, how do we acquire a language? Do we acquire a language the way we acquire other things, like a house, or a car, or a book? Definitely not. The processes couldn't be more different. When we acquire a car, do we build it? No. Maybe with a few exceptions. Building, however, is what we essentially do when we acquire a language. We engage in processes of individual and social construction that enable us to create our own version of English, my English, in our minds, in our hearts, and in our behaviors. Now, this sounds awfully idiosyncratic. But acquisitional construction is always and continually mediated and shaped by a number and a complex interplay of individual and social forces. For instance, my target language model, my native language, previous languages, my attitude and motivation, my goals and requirements, my learning approach, my learning effort, and, of course, very, very, very important, my communicative interaction and identification with others. When developing my English, it might be helpful to pay attention to 4 levels. On the one hand, we have linguistic means of expression, repertoires. This is what is in the very center of language teaching and language learning. But it's not linguistic means of expressions as such, but linguistic means of expressions in relation to certain requirements of performance, which I impose on my own communication. And what is more, my requirement profile, these requirements of performance, undergo a development from classroom to ELF contexts, for instance, or when you look at the development little children go through. Requirement profile regarding, for instance, correctness, situational appropriateness, satisfactory expression of one's meaning intent. I want to be satisfied with myself or being accepted in a speech fellowship. And very important, confidence, which as non-native learners we usually do not have, confidence in my non-native speaker creativity, because there is something like creativity here. Now, speaker learners, my English emerges from participation in actual communication and is continuously shaped and reshaped by situational adaptation and collaborative, cooperative negotiation. My English is the speaker's own creation by virtue of individual construction, and at the same time it is oriented towards the speaker's communicative and communal needs and desires by virtue of social embedding and collaborative negotiation. It is in this inwardly oriented fashion, this social constructivist fashion, that speaker learners develop their version of English and thereby become owners of English. Note that this concept, this notion of ownership by construction, is complementary to Widdowson's notion of ownership by use. Against this backdrop of a social constructivist understanding of language acquisition, we can now take a closer look at ELF as intercultural communication and at the various pedagogical focus areas we should attend to when teaching towards ELF competence. There is, of course, awareness raising.
Awareness of the nature of lingua franca communication in English, which will help learners increase their sensitivity and tolerance for others and for themselves. There is a focus on ELF-related comprehension challenges, for instance with regard to unfamiliar pronunciation and sentence structures, unclear utterance meanings due to wrong lexis, failed prepositions, or misleading elocutions, weak discourse structure and lack of coherence. There is a focus on ELF-related production challenges, concerning, for instance, the learner's desire to express themselves to their own satisfaction, their ability to successfully exploit and negotiate their lingua-cultural resources, and, very importantly, whether they are able to adapt their requirements of performance to conditions of ELF communication depending on the respective communicative situation, for instance by lowering the requirement of correctness compared to what they became used to in the ELT classroom. There is a focus on ELF-related challenges of communicative interaction, concerning strategies and attitudes, such as strategies of accommodation and collaborative meaning negotiation, and attitudes of cooperativity, empathy, and tolerance for ambiguity.
And there is a focus, or better, there should be a focus on learners as speakers of English, which involves helping learners to explore their own non-native speaker creativity, encouraging learners to judge their own performance by their own criteria of speaker satisfaction, and finally leading them towards an emancipated, or more modestly, a more emancipated non-native speaker identity. All these pedagogical focus areas are relevant for enabling speaker learners to develop their ELF competence. A kind of competence, however, that is not exclusively ELF. It is deeply grounded in our competence for ordinary communication, including communication in our native languages. Any training of ELF competence will thus be of little avail without taking into account the attitudes, requirement profiles, and strategic performance skills of speaker learners in their ordinary communication. And there is an interesting side effect. Teaching towards ELF competence in this way will enable speaker learners to further develop their communicative abilities in general. Now, if non-native speaker creativity, non-native speaker satisfaction, non-native speaker emancipation, if they are indeed relevant, how do they go along with having a standard English or maybe standard English native speaker orientation in the classroom? Isn't there a clash after all? Well, like so often in life, it depends. Now, I would say it depends on this distinction, which I would like to introduce, between a strict orientation towards standard native speaker English and an open orientation towards standard native speaker English. According to a strict orientation, which is very, very common in the classroom, learners are required to comply with the standard English native speaker teaching norms. There might be some tolerance, in particular in communicative approaches, but the closer they get, the better. A strict view, I think this is important to see and maybe painful, a strict view sees language learning essentially as a copying or cloning process and argues implicitly from a behavioristic position. And it's interesting that many teachers adopt this position while at the same time being, in other ways, enlightened teachers interested in learner autonomy and authenticity and these things. Now, according to an open orientation, learners use standard English native speaker English as a model of orientation for creating their own version. This open view follows from a social constructivist understanding, explicit or implicit, understanding of language learning as a social constructivist process of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral creation, which leaves sufficient leeway for, or should leave leeway for, non-native speaker creativity, speaker satisfaction, and non-native speaker emancipation. An open social constructivist view enables learners to establish their own brand of English, as it were, and thereby appropriate English for their local, communicative, and communal purposes. There is an issue regarding standard native speaker English as concepts. Maybe we can touch on this or pick this up in the discussion later, because I think it's important to make a distinction between these notions in the context of descriptive linguistics and these notions in the context of pedagogy. As a descriptive linguist, I might have serious problems with standard English and the notion of native speaker. But when I use these terms as a teacher in language teaching, I just work with a somewhat different construction. Now, in order to make teaching and learning towards ELF competence successful, it is essential to provide students with rich opportunities for authentic communication in intercultural contact zone interactions. It is quite obvious, however, that it is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve this in a face-to-face classroom. And there will be more on this at this conference, how we can move beyond the classroom. Now, one possibility is intercultural telecollaboration. And I want to briefly touch on the pedagogical potential of intercultural telecollaboration. This is based on our European projects, TILA and TECOLA. TECOLA is now active. In these projects, we address the foreign language learning needs with regard to this communicative intercultural extension of secondary school students in European countries. We have Germany, the Netherlands, France, Spain, and England involved. Online intercultural communication is in our projects mainly covered by video communication using Skype or Big Blue Button. Big Blue Button is similar to Adobe Connect, but it's a free tool, and virtual virtual worlds that is similar to Second Life, but this is a closed shop here for our pedagogical purposes based on OpenSim and chat and forum, and of course various tools for collaborating, because the whole approach is very much task-based oriented. Students work in pairs or small groups. I think this is very important to keep in mind when thinking about moving beyond the classroom. Communication, I mean, this is a special situation, one to many, but normally we have small group communication, and that's when it works. If the group starts getting bigger, then subgroups are being formed, and so it's small group communication. And it's a blended learning approach, or if you like, flipped learning approach. That is, we use intercultural telecollaboration for those things we would love to do in the classroom, but things we can't do in the classroom, at least not with this pedagogical effect. We have a lingua franca, a pedagogical lingua franca constellation. This means that in our projects, our students communicate with their intercultural partners in their common foreign language, which can be English, German students and Spanish students meeting in pairs or small groups to collaborate in English, or it could be German, Dutch and French students both learning German, and they use their German target language, foreign language, as a pedagogical lingua franca. Or Spanish, or it could be Mandarin or Tamil or Malay. Please note an important shift in perspective. In ELF informed suggestions for teaching, authentic natural ELF communication is used as a pedagogical target model for learning. What I am suggesting here now is that we switch from this perspective to the pedagogical lingua franca perspective, that is, where we actually create conditions in the classroom for using English or the target language as a pedagogical lingua franca. And we have, well, we move closer to authenticity. Something which is very important is telecollaboration access, well, from home, at least outside the classroom. In our projects, we notice that teachers have this urge to take their flock of students and carry them over to the computer room. And then they are all in this computer room. Oof. As a teacher, I wouldn't want to be in a computer room with 20 or 30 pupils. In particular, not if I want to engage them in oral communication, then it's just not possible. It's not possible, at least in Germany, in our schools, where the network capacity is just not powerful enough for having more than 3 or 4 parallel spoken interactions going on. In the written mode, it's different. And what is very important, of course, having several students in a room and then talking, even if it works with the technology, there's no communicative privacy. And we need communicative privacy. It's just between you and me. We are talking. And this is something which, where we achieve best results with engaging students from home, which, by the way, also improves their autonomy. They have to make appointments and have to meet, and things become more private. They do the task, but then, of course, always depending on the personal vibrations, things go on. And something which at the very beginning, a few years ago, when we started with these things, which were a little bit frustrating, namely that the students moved out of our environment to Facebook or WhatsApp. And no, we wanted them in our environment because we were interested in the recordings for research and these things. But, well, I mean, this is the best thing that can happen, right? I mean, we teach for life. And the best thing that can happen is if students then move out of the teaching context, not just the classroom, but the teaching context, and engage with each other in an even more authentic way. Multimodal telecollaboration arrangements, this is also very important, or we found is very important, and this concerns giving students options regarding the technology. Maybe the target is, or the focus is on video communication, but then for some reason the technology doesn't work. And more often than not, I mean, this might happen. You always need a plan B. So in that case, they can switch to a chat. If for whatever reason this doesn't work, there's still forum and other possibilities. And in some cases, students might be too shy to engage in a video communication right away, so they should start with the chat, or maybe asynchronous in a forum, and then gradually you can step up things. So scaffolding is involved here. And the wonderful thing is this approach, as I said, can be applied to and transferred to other foreign languages. English or German or Malay as a pedagogical lingua franca. Okay? There are a few case studies we conducted with our students, in this case based on conversations, and we noticed that many conversations were very cooperative, consensual, and supportive. Empathy and encouragement could be noticed. Oh God, I can't talk about it in English, and so on. Doesn't matter, I know, like, we are beginners and we haven't got such a level to speak about everything we want. An appreciation of authenticity. I think it's good because it puts us in a real situation, talking with real people. Satisfaction about the certain degree of autonomy, in this case with regard to the theme, the topic, or the task. Focus on communicated meaning. The facilitating effect of the pedagogical lingua franca condition. We both have the same level. We are in the same boat. That's very, very important. Increased confidence and self-assurance. Collaborative languaging, and, well, very important, learning to accept and tolerate uncertainty, even a breakdown. Now, I do not claim that all these wonderful things happen automatically when you engage in intercultural telecollaboration. These are possibilities. With our case studies, we can only observe possibilities. But these possibilities are so valuable. As teachers, it is our duty to make possibilities we find desirable happen. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kohn, for your very engaging talk on English as a lingua franca.